Hi, folks. Welcome to this special coronavirus edition of The Handy Philosopher. It's been a little while since I've done a recording, but yeah, this obviously very unique circumstance that we're living through at the moment. Um, Obviously, not making light of it at all. For those of you who are listening, stay home, don't go outside, uh, make sure you're washing your hands, washing your face. And yeah, basically do all of the things that we know are going to help to prevent the virus spreading any further than it needs to. Yeah, most of you listening, I'm assuming, are going to be younger, so just keep in mind that you're protecting the other people around you, not necessarily just yourself. But everyone does their part. We'll get through this just fine, I'm sure. Okay. But onto the topic of today. So this is a very short reading from Thomas Kuhn. So those of you who are in my year 11 class at the moment, this is what the first reading that we're going to be doing for our epistemology area of study. We're going to be looking at Kuhn and then another philosopher of science, Karl Popper. Now, these two men, very interestingly, had very different views on what science is here to do, how science should arrive at its conclusions, and yeah, really kind of very different views on almost everything to do with the scientific field. So it is interesting. A little bit of background on Kuhn. He's a physicist by trade. So uh, whilst he is famous within the philosophical world for being a philosopher of science, he is also a trained scientist and certainly knows what he's talking about when he's talking about scientific principles. Uh, and I'm going to be reading a little bit from his text, The Structure of Scientific Revolution. So, without any further ado, let's jump in. So, first, uh, before we get stuck into the reading, I think it's important to get a little background on Kuhn's view. Um, and primarily, I think what we need to understand, particularly when we're comparing Kuhn to Popper, which we'll do once we've done the Popper reading as well, is we need to understand the very different um, views that they had around what science was actually here to do. Um, uh, for Kuhn, science was there to be a problem solver for society. Okay, um, so uh, what we really need to understand here, and when we're talking about this in the field of epistemology and in philosophy, obviously epistemology is all about the study of knowledge and what it takes to be able to say that you know something or that you're certain of something, um, or that you can be sure of something. All of these things fall under the branch of epistemology. And because science is a field that attempts to generate sort of a wealth of knowledge, obviously it falls under that category as well. Uh, so what's interesting is that Kuhn definitely did not think that science was there to give us truth or certainty. Uh, that's not the primary purpose of science, according to Kuhn. The primary purpose of science is to find or to deal with the problems of society, whatever problem we're facing, and then attempt to generate a solution to that problem. Um, as such, as it says on the slide there, scientific progress, according to Kuhn, was not progression towards the truth. Okay, science wasn't progressing towards some correct answer or some universal truth. It was simply progression in terms of the number of problems that we could solve. Okay, um, so it's really important we understand this because, as we're about to see with the next slide, um, this really informs what it takes for a scientific theory to enter a phase of what Kuhn refers to as paradigm shift, which sounds a little bit, science fiction-y almost, but it's a relatively straightforward concept, which we'll go through in a moment. Before I change the slide, For those of you who don't know, that's Vanilla Ice. Um, you know, the 90s were a wonderful time to be young, but there were some things that were truly terrible. And a lot of, whilst there was some great music that came out of the 90s, there was a whole lot of trash too. And Vanilla Ice was definitely in the latter category. Um, for those of you who yearn to be a child of the 90s, it wasn't as good as you're imagining it to be. Trust me. But anyway, if you don't know, check out Vanilla Ice, Ice Ice Baby, and you'll see exactly what the 90s were really like. Back to Kuhn. All right, so what is Kuhn's actual theory around paradigm shift? Um, so, uh, First, before we talk about paradigm shift, let's talk about what a scientific paradigm is. So the first dot point there talks about, a scientific paradigm is a framework of an area of science. It includes the commonly held beliefs about the subject matter, the content written into the textbooks, the training methods of the scientists in the field of study, and the apparatus um, that are used to test hypotheses. So basically, the way to think of a paradigm is um, everything within a scientific community, from the books that are written to the tools that they use you know, um, to measure and observe things, to the type of training that people get, to what's being taught in, uh, everything from a science classroom at primary school all the way up to what people are writing their PhD on in that area at university. Like that's what the paradigm is. It is the principles of that field. Now, when I say that field, I don't mean like an entire um, area of science like biology or chemistry or physics. What I mean is the very particular sub study within those fields. Okay, um, yeah, this will probably become a little bit clearer when we start looking at our example, um, but yeah, so a change in a paradigm is quite dramatic. Because really what we're saying is everything that we had written about and believed and taught our children was actually not the best answer. And there's this other thing that is now a better answer. So it can be quite, at a different time in the text, Kuhn talks about it being quite a destructive um, force in the scientific world, in that it completely can, well, at times can completely destroy the previous paradigm. Um, so these events where we have paradigm shift are quite rare, and Kuhn talks about them as, the normal process of science is that a problem arises that the current paradigm can't solve. And so we adjust the current paradigm, and then that paradigm can continue on as normal. So we make minor adjustments to things, a little bit like sort of fine tuning a theory or tuning up an engine or something like that. And that gets it working a little bit better. And now it's able to solve the problem that it's facing. Um, Paradigm shift doesn't happen until we can't actually do that anymore. Okay. So it's not until a paradigm actually breaks down and no amount of adjustment to the paradigm will allow us to solve problems anymore. That's when we get a paradigm shift, according to Kuhn. Okay. Um, when we look at Kuhn's overall theory, he referred to this as being basically like a cycle. Okay. Um, so we start off, and to a certain degree, we haven't really experienced pre-science. You could argue that there's a little bit of pre-science in psychology at the moment, with some of the like psychological theories, as opposed to the biological theories that are in psychology. Um, But pre-science, think of sort of like the ancient world, like the ancient Greeks, looking up into the sky and basically just coming up with ideas of how the universe worked, how things interacted with each other. Because they didn't have the type of resources that we have now, they really couldn't test anything. Their observations were really just what could be observed with the human eye. Um, and so there were lots of different theories, like lots of different ways to explain how things happened, and none of them were seen to be correct or incorrect. You just agreed with one theory as opposed to the other. Um, so this is what Kuhn referred to as the pre-science stage of science. So when a scientific field is quite new, or there's a new phenomenon that we can observe, then we get the stage of pre-science, okay, where there's multiple competing theories. Um, all of them are sort of accepted, but people will believe or subscribe to one over the other for kind of their own reasons. Some will point to certain forms of evidence, some will point to logic as evidence, but there's really no knockout blow that one theory gives us that the others don't, and that's what, allows it to be the theory of science for the time. Um, when that does eventually happen, and we get the one theory that sort of rises up amongst all of the others, then we enter the period of normal science. Now, Kuhn is very clear that normal science is kind of what we exist in most of the time. And so normal science is a period of time where the theories that we have in science solve our problems really effectively. So a problem pops up, and all we have to do is apply our scientific theory to it, and that explains what's going on with the problem. Okay, so why do the tides change the way that they do? Oh, okay, so let's apply the theory of gravity to that and talk about the moon's gravitational influence on the Earth and that changing the flow of the oceans. And there you go. We've got an explanation for tides. Um, can I still say, oh, it's the god Poseidon being angry, and so this is why we get high tides or low tides or whatever? I can still say that, but within the scientific community, that will no longer be accepted as a legitimate theory. Okay, so that's not seen to be correct within science at all. There's only one theory accepted, and that's the gravitational pull of the moon affecting the oceans of the Earth. Um, Every now and then, our theory will face a problem that it can't immediately solve, and this leads us to the next stage, which is adjustment. Okay, and there really should be an arrow pointing back up to normal science from adjustment, because that mini cycle happens constantly. So the theory isn't quite perfect, so we adjust the theory, and now we can explain that thing before. And then something else will pop up that we can't explain quite perfectly, and so we adjust it, and now we can explain that phenomenon and we can solve that problem. And this can happen for a very long time. Like a strong scientific theory, like, you know, gravity, can exist with nothing but adjustments to the theory to better understand things, for a very, very long time. Uh, but what Kuhn thought will happen is eventually, you will reach a point of crisis. Okay. Now, for a scientific theory to reach crisis, what we're really talking about is that the scientific theory can no longer fulfill the role that Kuhn thinks it should play in the world. Okay, and so that is, the role as a problem solver for our society. Remember, for Kuhn, that is what science is here to do. It's here to solve our problems. Okay, I can't communicate with someone far away from me. Science gives us the ability to speak over vast distances using, radio frequencies, for example. Okay, so problem solution. But now our theory is running into problems that it can't solve. And quite often, when we go back and we try and adjust it to get back into that stage of normal science, which used to work all the time, we'd make an adjustment and then we'd go back to normal science. That was fine. Now, if I try and make an adjustment, I might solve one problem over here, but then three more pop up over there. And so my solution is actually making things even worse. This is a sign of a scientific theory in crisis. It's no longer fulfilling the function of science in society, according to Kuhn. This then leads us to the stage of revolution. And as the title of the book talks about, Kuhn argues that scientific theories there's a set structure to the revolution. So revolution is a little bit like the pre-science stage, where this is now the opportunity for theories that are new to come back sort of into the light and to actually be considered within the scientific community. Up to this point, if you had a different view of gravity or a different view of evolution or a different view of whatever scientific principle you're talking about, you were not accepted in the scientific community. But now the scientific community is facing crisis. Okay, we can no longer solve the problems that are being presented to us. So, you know what? If you've got a theory, let's talk about it. Let's see if it works. Does it problem solve better than some other theory? Okay, and this is the stage of revolution. Revolution can be relatively quick if a new theory has sort of been waiting in the wings a long time. Then it might come in, begin solving problems immediately, show itself to be a better theory almost immediately, and be adopted by the scientific community very quickly. Or we can sort of stumble around in the dark for a long time, waiting for a new theory to come up. Okay, so this process of revolution can be very short or very long, but once a new theory is accepted, then we enter the stage of normal science. Okay, but this is a big event when revolution occurs. Okay, it means science textbooks have to be rewritten. It means scientists have to be retrained in the new theory. It means all the way down to primary school level, we've got we've got to change the way that we talk about whatever principle we're talking about, and then this gets us up to back into normal science. Funnily enough, any scientist who refuses to change, who sticks with the old theory, is now no longer considered a scientist. They're removed from the scientific community. They're excommunicated. And so it's quite a dramatic thing that can occur. Just to give you a really mini example of this, and this isn't really a paradigm shift, but a lot of you will remember, not all that long ago, we had the change from Pluto being considered a planet to now it being considered a dwarf planet. So let's run this through the process of paradigm shift just quickly so that you can see what we're talking about. This isn't going to include the pre-science stage because that was a long time ago, but let's discuss sort of how we define how we got to that point that Pluto is no longer considered a planet. So firstly, normal science, Pluto was a planet. Okay, this is probably what a lot of you learnt when you were in primary school, or you can still find textbooks that refer to Pluto as a planet. So yeah, Pluto is a planet, normal science. Okay, this allowed us to explain how, what constituted a planet in terms of its, orbit around the sun and yada, yada, yada. But for those of you who don't know, Pluto's orbit is quite weird. Sometimes it's really, really far away from the sun. Other times it's a little bit closer. So it doesn't orbit in sort of the roughly same circle that other planets do. So we had to make adjustments to the scientific theory to allow Pluto to still be considered a planet. Okay, um, which was fine, except those adjustments led to a few issues. Um, Firstly, we reached a problem, and this is one of the things that kind of triggered the crisis at this very small example. If we allowed Pluto to be considered a planet, then uh, other bodies in our solar system, like the Earth's moon, would fall under the same category. And so then we'd have to refer to the moon as a planet as opposed to a moon, something that orbits a planet, which is obviously problematic. We don't see the moon as its own planet. We see it as something that orbits Earth, so it is a moon. Um, but we couldn't accept Pluto as a planet without also accepting the moon as a planet. And so this led to the crisis, okay? Whilst we were trying to solve the problem of what should Pluto count as, we were creating a new problem with the moon. This led to this mini revolution we're talking about, where the definition of what it takes to be a planet was um, changed. And now Pluto was removed from planetary status, and we now refer to it as a dwarf planet. The moon is still a moon. Everything's good to go. Okay. Um, Importantly, what we need to understand with this is that if you're an astronomer or a cosmologist or whatever, and you think that Pluto should still be a planet, that's fine. You can think that, but the scientific community doesn't. So if you're going to say that, you can't say that in a scientific sense. Just a very small example to demonstrate what we're talking about here. All right, let's get into the reading. I've already rabbited on for 20 minutes, but hopefully we're getting an understanding of this process that Kuhn talks about. The first part of the reading, so we're starting on page 68 of Kuhn's text, is going to walk us through an example of scientific revolution. Okay. Now, this revolution that we're going to look at is referred to as the Copernican Revolution. Just a quick thing about some sort of lingo or vocabulary that we need to make sure we've got our head around. So we're going to see a few things written or talked about. There's the Ptolemaic system, the geocentric system, or the Earth-centered solar system. Now, all three of these actually mean the same thing. Okay, so Ptolemy is the person who was credited as creating the theory that the Earth is the center of our solar system, and creating maps of planetary movement and sun movement revolving around the Earth. Geocentric, so this is just another way of saying the Earth-centered solar system. Then we've got the Copernican system. So Copernicus is the person who's credited with suggesting that the sun is the center of our solar system and everything revolves around it. This is referred to as the heliocentric system, or more simply, the sun-centered solar system. So I just want to make that clear, so that you understood, like if you see those terms at all while you're reading, or you're doing some extra research about this stuff, then you know what they're talking about. So Ptolemaic, geocentric, Earth-centered, all the same. Copernican, heliocentric, sun-centered, all the same. Okay, so here we go, page 68. Look first at a particularly famous case of paradigm change, the emergence of Copernican astronomy. When its predecessor, the Ptolemaic system, was first developed during the last 2 centuries before Christ and the first 2 after, it was admirably successful in predicting the changing positions of both stars and planets. So just to pause for a second here, don't confuse the Earth-centered solar system with a theory like, that the Earth is flat. I know that there are still people out there who believe that, which absolutely blows my mind. But There's really never been any scientific suggestion that the Earth is flat. I mean, you could go back very early on when we had basically zero data about the layout of the Earth and say that, but it wasn't really a scientific theory. It was just the Earth appeared flat. So this is not science. Don't confuse just a basic observation with science. Um, the Ptolemaic system or the Earth-centered solar system, this was a well-established scientific theory in all of the ways that we expect science to operate. And by that I mean it solved problems. Like you could predict the movement of the other planets and the stars um, with the maps that were created with the Earth as the center of the solar system. It worked quite well. Okay, so this was a legitimate scientific theory. Like this is what was taught to people. Um, so it's just worth remembering that. Don't confuse the Earth-centered solar system with a, you know, something like the Earth is flat. That's never really been a scientific principle. No other ancient system had performed so well for the stars. Ptolemaic astronomy is still widely used today as an engineering approximation for the planets. Ptolemy's predictions were as good as Copernicus's. Now, this is a very important thing. So, at the end here, he says Ptolemy's predictions were as good as Copernicus's. So, in this early stage, Ptolemy's system, the Earth-centered solar system, solved problems as good as, if not better, than the Copernican system did. So why would we change to the Copernican system when the Ptolemaic system works even better? And this is sort of the point that is being made here. Yes, the Copernican theory that the sun was the center of the solar system was around for a little while, but no one really gave it any thought because, well, we had a system that worked perfectly well, and in fact, in most cases, worked better. So why would we change? But to be admirably rather successful is never for a scientific theory to be completely successful. With respect to both to planetary position and to precession of the equinoxes, predictions made with Ptolemy's system never quite conformed with the best available observations. So what Kuhn's talking about here is as good as Ptolemy's system was, it was never quite hitting the bullseye. It got really close, but and you know if you used it, you'd be really close, but you wouldn't exactly hit the mark, so it wasn't quite perfect. Further reduction of those minor discrepancies constituted many of the principal problems of normal astronomical research for many of Ptolemy's successors, just as a similar attempt to bring celestial observation and Newtonian theory together provided normal research problems for Newton's 18th century successors. For some time, astronomers had every reason to suppose that these attempts would be as successful as those that had led to Ptolemy's system. Given a particular discrepancy, astronomers were invariably able to eliminate it by making some particular adjustment in Ptolemy's system of compounded circles. So this is what Kuhn's talking about here is the adjustment stage. Okay, so given a particular discrepancy or something that didn't fit the theory, astronomers were invariably able to eliminate it by making some particular adjustment in Ptolemy's system of compounded circles. So astronomers would be able to sort of tweak it just a little bit. They'd make an adjustment and this would solve the problem. But as time went on, a man looking at the net result of the normal research efforts of many astronomers could observe that astronomy's complexity was increasing far more rapidly than its accuracy, and that a discrepancy corrected in one place was likely to show up in another. So as this happened more and more, as more and more adjustments were made to the Ptolemaic system, then it sort of started to lose its ability to solve problems. We'd solve one problem here and another one would pop up over there. Okay. Think of think of like a paper bag that you use continuously. The first time you use it, it's going to work fine. And the second time, it probably will as well. And the third and the fourth time you put something in it, and the fifth. But as we all know, that paper bag is slowly going to lose a lot of its strength. Um, and eventually it's going to get to a point where it doesn't do what it's supposed to do anymore, which is hold whatever I'm putting into it. This is essentially the crisis stage that we're talking about in science. Um, and this is what Kuhn is really talking about at this point. So we're now at that point where when I try and put something into the paper bag, it falls out of a hole over here, and I'll try and, seal up the hole over here, but then another hole will form over there. This is what's going on at this stage. Because the astronomical tradition was repeatedly interrupted from outside, and because in the absence of printing communication between astronomers, uh, was restricted, these difficulties were only slowly recognized. So there's two things that Ptolemy views as being, that Kuhn views as being different about this revolution. Firstly, there was a lot of influence from an external force. In this case, we're talking about the Catholic Church. They had been teaching a Earth-centered view of the solar system for a very long time, and so this would have disrupted their religious belief. And so they were very opposed to that happening. But also, we're talking about a very early time in sort of academic history, a time before things like textbooks. So it was very hard to have one person communicating with another at that time. So it's not like I could just, make a copy of a book and send it off to a colleague and say, hey, can you have a read through this and let me know what you think? It really wasn't that simple. So it took a long time for problems to really be understood. But, Kuhn continues, awareness did come. By the 13th century, Alfonso X could proclaim that if God had consulted him when creating the universe, he would have received good advice. So what this quote is really saying is that Alfonso X was identifying that he was not suggesting that God didn't know what he was doing. He was suggesting that the Earth-centered solar system map was a mess. Okay, and if this is really what God created, if this is really how God had laid out the planets and the stars, then God was sort of drunk at the wheel when he did it, because everything was just completely messed up. In the 16th century, Copernicus's co-worker Domenico da Novara held that no system so cumbersome and inaccurate as the Ptolemaic had become could possibly be true of nature. So once again, another person saying this is just way too off the mark. This is way too problematic. It's not solving problems anymore. And Copernicus himself wrote in the preface to the De Revolutionibus that the astronomical tradition he inherited had finally created only a monster. And in this preface, Copernicus talks about it as like a Frankenstein monster. So it's got bits and pieces from all over the place sewn together, and it's like, what were we trying to create? We were trying to create a human, and instead what we created was a monster. What were we trying to create with the Ptolemaic system? We're trying to create a way to be able to accurately predict the movement of the stars and the planets. But what we got instead was this jumbled mess of movement. By the early 16th century, an increasing number of Europe's best astronomers were recognizing that the astronomical paradigm was failing in application to its own traditional problems. That recognition was prerequisite to Copernicus's rejection of the Ptolemaic paradigm and his search for a new one. His famous preface still provides one of the classic descriptions of a crisis state. So Copernicus basically said, look, it's time to admit that the Earth-centered solar system is not working and is incorrect. it's time to start looking for a new system. And this is what led him to developing the first sun-centered solar system maps. Breakdown of the normal technical puzzle-solving activity is not, of course, the only ingredient of the astronomical crisis that faced Copernicus. An extended treatment would also discuss the social pressure for calendar reform, a pressure that made the puzzle of precession particularly urgent. In addition, a fuller account would consider medieval criticism of Aristotle, the rise of Renaissance Neoplatonism, and other significant historical elements besides. But technical breakdown would still remain the core of the crisis. So we don't really need to, for our purposes at least, we don't really need to know much about the other stuff that Kuhn's talking about here. That last sentence, but technical breakdown would still remain the core of the crisis. Really, he's telling you what crisis is all about. When a theory can no longer solve problems. This is the crisis stage, technical breakdown of the theory. Okay. In a mature science, and astronomy had become that in antiquity, external factors like those cited above are particularly significant in determining the timing of breakdown, the ease with which it can be recognized, and the area in which, because it is given particular attention, the breakdown first occurs. Though immensely important, issues of that sort are out of bounds for this essay. So Kuhn is sort of saying that he's just focusing on the technical problem-solving breakdown of a theory as being the trigger for revolution. Okay, and he sees that to be the most significant. All right, we're going to skip ahead a little bit here and go to page 74, 75, 76. All right, and here I'll sort of skim through the first part pretty quickly. It's not until the very end that we really get the juicy stuff. It's worth noting that the parts that we're missing, Kuhn talks about a few other examples of paradigm shift. We only need to know about one, and the Copernican shift is a good one. It's one that we can all understand relatively easily, but the others are important as well. But yeah, we're just going to focus on the one. Okay, so here we go. These three examples are almost entirely typical. In each case, and this is the examples of paradigm shift, so we looked at the Copernican one. In each case, a novel theory, a new theory, that means, emerged only after a pronounced failure in the normal problem-solving activity. So once again, we're getting this problem-solving idea. Furthermore, except for the case of Copernicus, in which factors external to to science played a particularly large role, that breakdown and the proliferation of theories that is its sign occurred no more than a decade or two before the new theory's enunciation. The novel theory seems a direct response to crisis. Note also rather, though this may not be quite so typical, that the problems with respect to which breakdown occurred were all of a type that had long been recognized. Previous practice of normal science had given every reason to consider them solved, or all but solved, which helps to explain why the sense of failure, when it came, could be so acute. So, don't think that this paradigm shift is not, for lack of a better word, hurtful within the scientific community. Like, this is not something that scientists are very good at, because they're not trained to be looking for other explanations. They're trained to be making precise observations, and for the vast majority of scientists at least, to make those observations within the boundaries of the accepted scientific paradigm of their day. This is not that. This is complete breakdown of that. And so it can be very difficult for scientists to do that. And quite often science faces a lot of resistance from members within the scientific community when they try to do that. Let's continue. Failure with a new sort of problem is often disappointing, but never surprising. Neither problems nor puzzles yield often to the first attack. Finally, these examples share another characteristic that may help to make the case for the role of crisis impressive. The solution to each of them had been at least partially anticipated during a period when there was no crisis in the corresponding science, and in the absence of crisis, those anticipations had been ignored. So if you are a bit of a maverick in the scientific community, and if you're creating new scientific theories, you can then talk to people about it, but you'll probably be laughed off the stage. You'll probably be called crazy, or you'll probably be told that you're wasting people's time. It's not until the crisis stage that science will actually entertain theories from other people. One of the other examples that Kuhn talks about in the book is a good example of this, in that Einstein's theory of relativity and then theory of special relativity, these are examples of paradigm shift in the field of physics. And what's interesting is that for a long time, when Einstein suggested these theories, he was kind of refused entry into the scientific community. He wasn't accepted. People didn't accept his theory. He was seen to be a bit of a crackpot, a bit of a nutter. And so it wasn't until there were problems that couldn't be solved by the current, existing theories of physics that Einstein's theory of relativity and special theory actually got a little bit of airtime and got some consideration. So, as it says right at the end of that part, in the absence of crisis, those anticipations, so any new theories, had been ignored. The only complete anticipation is also the most famous, that of Copernicus by Aristarchus in the 3rd century BC. It is often said that if Greek science had been less deductive and less ridden by dogma, heliocentric astronomy might have begun its development 18 centuries earlier than it did. So the Greeks had a few issues with the way that they did science. And what's being said here is, if they'd done science the way that we do now, not necessarily with the tools that we do now, but just with the principles that we have now, they probably would have developed the heliocentric view of the solar system a long time before Copernicus did, 18 centuries before, actually. But that is to ignore all historical context. When Aristarchus' suggestion was made, the vastly more reasonable geocentric system had no need that a heliocentric system might ever conceivably have fulfilled. So in other words, whilst we might say that about the Greeks, there was no reason to be looking for another theory, because the geocentric theory worked perfectly at that time. The whole development of Ptolemaic astronomy, both its triumphs and its breakdown, falls in the centuries after Aristarchus' proposal. Besides, there were no obvious reasons for taking Aristarchus seriously. Even Copernicus's more elaborate proposal was neither simpler nor more accurate than Ptolemy's system. Available observational tests, as we shall see more clearly below, provide no basis for a choice between them. Under those circumstances, one of the factors that led astronomers to Copernicus, and one that could not have led them to Aristarchus, was the recognized crisis that had been responsible for innovation in the first place. Ptolemaic astronomy had failed to solve its problems. The time had come to give a competitor a chance. So that's a really important little line there. Ptolemaic astronomy had failed to solve its problems. So it was no longer operating the way that normal science should. And so it was time to give a competitor, the heliocentric view, a chance. But surely one reason why the theories of combustion by absorption from the atmosphere, theories developed in the 17th century by Ray, Hooke, and Mayow, failed to get a sufficient hearing, was that they made no contact with a recognized trouble spot in normal scientific practice. These are theories that Kuhn talked about earlier, by the way. And the long neglect by 18th and 19th century scientists of Newton's relativistic critics must largely have been due to a similar failure in confrontation. Philosophers of science have repeatedly demonstrated that more than one theoretical construction can always be placed upon a given collection of data. History of science indicates that, particularly in the early developmental stages of a new paradigm, it is not even very difficult to invent such alternates. So this is the pre-science stage, when we can have lots of different paradigms sort of competing. But that invention of alternates is just what scientists seldom undertake except during the pre-paradigm stage of their science's development, and at very special occasions during its subsequent evolution. So that idea of like looking for new theories to explain concepts, it's not really what scientists do, okay? Because it's not focused on problem solving. And that's, for Kuhn at least, really what science is there to do. So long as the tools a paradigm supplies continue to prove capable of solving the problems it defines, science moves fastest and penetrates most deeply through confident employment of those tools. So in other words, the scientific community work best when everyone agrees that we're going to use this theory, we're going to apply it in this way, and because everyone's sort of pointing in the same direction and everyone's using the same idea, it works really well that way, and you get some good results. The reason is clear. As in manufacture, so in science, retooling is an extravagance to be reserved for the occasion that demands it. So this last bit, Kuhn's drawing a parallel between science and the manufacturing community. Think about it this way, you've just set up a factory to manufacture, let's say, t-shirts, okay? You're making t-shirts and you've just pumped in all of these resources to set this factory up, and it's just started going and it's humming along. Now, let's imagine for a moment, all right, that someone comes to you and says, oh, that machine that you've put in over there, I've actually created a new one, and it creates t-shirts, 1 minute faster, or let's say even less, 10 seconds faster than your machine does. Why don't you rip out all of those machines from your factory and put mine in, and then you'll save 10 seconds on every t-shirt that you make. Now, that's going to add up to a lot of t-shirts in the long run, but think of how much that would cost. I've just set up my factory, I've got all of this machinery in there, and it's working really well. I'm finally producing things, I'm selling, it's working. Okay, the problem that I've got is being solved by the machinery that I've got in there at the moment. Am I really going to throw all of that away just to gain 10 extra seconds? Okay, this is what Kuhn means by, as in manufacture, so in science, retooling is an extravagance to be reserved for the occasion that demands it. When I'll consider that new machine? When my old machine breaks down. Now I have a demand for change. Okay, I've got a problem in that I want to make t-shirts, and my current paradigm, the machinery I've got in my factory, won't allow me to do that. So you know what? Now I will look at alternatives. Okay, but not until then. I'm not going to change everything in my factory just cause. The significance of crisis is the indication they provide that an occasion for retooling has arrived. Okay, so crisis is really the key thing that leads to a paradigm shift. Okay, hopefully you've been able to follow along with that. Kuhn's theory, I really like Kuhn's theory of science, and when I talk to other people within the scientific community, particularly teachers of science, and I talk to them about Kuhn versus Popper, most of them reply that Kuhn had it correct, that science is there to solve problems for us. Obviously, there are some issues with this. It means that we can't really consider things certain in science this way, because we never know when something is going to reach that crisis point, particularly from outside of the scientific community, because we really don't know what's going on within the scientific community. So we don't really know what's going to trigger that crisis and revolution. So we can't really say we're certain of anything in science if we subscribe to Kuhn's theory. Um, so this is sort of the big problem of the theory itself. Look, I hope you've enjoyed. I'll do another few recordings while we're at home. And yeah, look, if you enjoyed it, like and subscribe to the Handy Philosopher channel. There's a whole bunch of videos if you end up taking year 12 next year. There's there's videos for every single one of the readings on the channel already. I hope it helps. If you've got any questions, send me an email or chuck it in the comments and I'll give it a go at answering. But yeah, the next one will be Popper. I'm not sure if we'll be doing it at school or if we'll be doing it from home. But just a reminder, everyone, stay inside. Make sure you maintain that social distance. Make sure you're washing your hands regularly, disinfecting surfaces, and let's look after each other. Be kind to each other, and yeah, let's make sure that we're helping out the people who are most vulnerable in our community. Okay? All right. Have a good day, everyone, and I'll see you soon. Bye.